Hi there, my name is Lindsay Roberts, and today I will be talking about the feedback loops of the female reproductive system. Just to provide some introduction, wanted to kind of compare and contrast positive versus negative feedback loops because there's a lot of complications and a lot of complex feedback loops in the reproductive system. In terms of positive feedback, these occur when the response to a stimulus actually amplifies that initial stimuli. So it creates this cascade of A heightening B, leading to a runaway effect that will just keep ramping up unless another physiological process stops that cycle. It's less commonly occurring in the human body as opposed to negative feedback loops. But a good example would be the oxytocin release during the birth process, when oxytocin is released and causes uterine contractions to continue to amplify, which is then basically stopped by a complete birth. When the birth process is complete, that cuts off that positive feedback loop. Now, with negative feedback loops, the response to a stimuli actually removes or stops the stimulus from occurring, and this process is intended to maintain homeostasis. It stabilizes more of a regulated variable. It is more commonly occurring in the human body. And another example of the negative feedback loop would be one which occurs during the menstrual cycle, when the feedback loop of estrogen acts on the gonadal steroids. Now, just to give some introduction, these are all of the hormones at play that act upon each other in the reproductive system. And the next few slides will get into a little more detail on how each of them stimulate or inhibit each other to make the menstrual cycle and the birthing process come to fruition. Now, just to give an introduction to these hormones that are at work, kind of the initial hormone at play here is a neuropeptide called kisspeptin. Now, this is one that controls the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So it acts on GnRH, which is created in the hypothalamus, which then continues on to control the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This hormone in the hypothalamus acts upon the release of these two anterior pituitary hormones, which then stimulate an action in the gonads. So follicle-stimulating hormone, it actually stimulates gamete production in the gonads, helps follicles to mature during the menstrual cycle. Luteinizing hormone additionally stimulates the production of estrogen and progesterone, and this hormone, or a surge in this hormone, triggers the ovulation cycle. A third hormone that is released by the pituitary is called oxytocin, and I previously mentioned this one. It stimulates uterine contraction at the start of labor. So that is an introduction to all of the hormones at work. Now, wanted to focus on estrogen for a minute because there's kind of a unique feedback process during the cycling of the reproductive system. So when steroids in the gonads are low, there is an increase in FSH and LH by the pituitary. In addition, when there are more moderate levels of estrogen, that triggers a negative feedback loop and decreases LH and FSH. High androgen levels, or high levels of gonadotropins, those additionally trigger a negative feedback loop and decrease LH and FSH. Now the transition here occurs when there are sustained high estrogen levels for approximately 36 hours. That negative feedback loop actually switches to a positive feedback loop and actually increases LH and FSH secretion by the pituitary. So it starts as a negative feedback loop, and then kind of a plot twist switches to a positive feedback loop with these sustained estrogen levels. Now, focusing on the menstrual cycle, in the early follicular phase where follicles are developing and that primary follicle is getting ready for the ovulation process, there is a negative feedback loop at play due to increasing levels of estrogen. So when these estrogen levels increase, GnRH in the hypothalamus is inhibited, which then results in inhibition of FSH and LH. This negative feedback loop is actually preventing the development of too many follicles in the same cycle. So focusing on developing one follicle to completion in preparation for ovulation. And I have a diagram on the right here that breaks down that process and the feedback loop changes that are occurring. Now, as the menstrual cycle continues, when we get to the ovulation phase, which is the second phase, there is actually a positive feedback loop occurring that leads to the surge in luteinizing hormone. This is an example of a negative feedback loop transitioning to a positive feedback loop, because as estrogen is increasing in its secretion, this leads to an increase in GnRH in the secretion in the hypothalamus, which then leads to this extra surge of luteinizing hormone at the peak of ovulation. And then in the last phase, the luteal phase, progesterone is the primary hormone at work. We transition back to a negative feedback loop. These high levels of progesterone actually inhibit GnRH and subsequently LH, and this prevents further ovulation during this phase. So it's kind of monitoring the cycle so that only one stage of ovulation is occurring. Wanted to give just one more example of a positive feedback loop, although I know the assignment said focus on the reproductive cycle when someone is not pregnant. This just kind of details the positive feedback loop that occurs when oxytocin is released at the start of labor. So I just thought it was unique that basically stretch receptors are being activated and send a signal to the brain. This mechanoreceptor being activated stimulates release of oxytocin. This triggers uterine contractions, and it just there continues to be this stretch activation, which then leads to more oxytocin releasing, further intensifying contractions, And then this positive loop ends with a complete birth. So just wanted to touch on that briefly. This completes my overview of feedback loops. Thank you for watching.